Have you ever felt your dignity being chipped away by seemingly innocent questions? The well-meaning inquiry about when you might finally move to a retirement home, or the concerned look that accompanies, should you still be driving at your age? These questions, often asked by those who claim to care about us most, can leave us feeling diminished, as though our independence has an expiration date that others feel entitled to determine. As we grow older, we face a world that increasingly questions our competence, our choices, and our right to live on our own terms. But what if you could reclaim your peace of mind by understanding which questions deserve no answer? What if preserving your dignity was as simple as knowing when to engage and when to gracefully redirect? Today, we're exploring how to protect your inner peace by recognizing the questions that undermine your autonomy and learning practical strategies to respond. With wisdom rather than defensiveness, you'll discover why explaining yourself creates vulnerability and how setting boundaries can transform your relationships with even your most well-intentioned loved ones. Wisdom isn't just about accumulating knowledge. It's about knowing what deserves your energy and what doesn't. By the end of our time together, you'll have practical tools to respond to intrusive questions in ways that preserve your dignity without damaging important relationships. To illustrate this wisdom in action, let me share a story about a special group of people who discovered the power of selective engagement. We're here to share life lessons worth remembering. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Continuing. The morning sunlight filters through the large windows of the Oak Ridge Haven Community Center as 6 chairs form a circle in the reading room. Leo Pierce, a former psychologist with kind eyes and measured speech, arranges note cards on a small table. Today marks the 4th session of his Wisdom Circle, initially conceived as a book club, but evolving into something far more valuable. A sanctuary where residents can discuss navigating the complex terrain of aging with dignity. As members arrive, Leo observes their body language. Diane enters with uncharacteristic slumped shoulders, while Nora's typically confident stride appears hesitant. Something is bothering them both. "Before we begin," Leo says, once everyone is seated, "I've noticed a pattern in our previous discussions. We've all encountered questions, seemingly innocent, that actually undermine our autonomy or dignity. Questions that deserve no answer." Edwin Blackwood, adjusting his glasses, nods thoughtfully. "Questions designed not for connection, but for classification." Leo smiles. "Exactly. Being cold in response to certain questions isn't about being unfriendly. It's about being wise, protecting our peace." Ruby Frost, her silver hair accented with a streak of purple, leans forward. "Like yesterday when my daughter asked, 'When are you moving to a retirement home?' as if this was something I should naturally be considering." Her voice wavers slightly. "It left me feeling diminished, as though my independence had an expiration date." "That's precisely what I'm talking about," Leo responds, writing something on his note card. "Questions about changing our living arrangements often hide assumptions about our capabilities." Frank Reed, whose mechanical precision extends to his neatly pressed shirts, clears his throat. "For me, it's, why do you still drive? My son asks every visit, though I've never had an accident." He taps his fingers against his knee. "Makes me feel like my competence is constantly under review." Around the circle, heads nod in recognition, each person recalling similar moments when seemingly innocent questions had robbed them of their peace, questioned their judgment, or diminished their sense of self. Leo looks around at the circle, his eyes gentle but determined. Today, we're going to identify these questions that deserve no answer and develop strategies to respond with dignity, not with coldness, but with wisdom. Nora, smoothing her linen pants, speaks next. "For me, it's the constant, 'Don't you get bored now that you're retired?' As if without a courtroom my life suddenly lacks purpose." She straightens her shoulders. At first, I felt compelled to list all my activities, like I needed to justify how I spend my time. Now I simply say, my days are full and nothing more. That's exactly the approach we're exploring. Leo nods appreciatively. The third question to recognize, ones that challenge the value of our current life choices. Diane, whose elegant posture can't quite mask the vulnerability in her eyes, hesitates before sharing. Mine is personal. Since meeting Richard, who's 12 years younger, I constantly hear, isn't it a bit soon to be dating again? Or the even more painful, don't you think the age difference is problematic? She looks down at her hands. It's been 3 years since Harold passed. Am I supposed to consult some cosmic calendar before allowing myself happiness? You shouldn't have to justify your heart's timeline, Ruby says softly, reaching over to squeeze Diane's hand. Leo writes on another note card, the fourth question to recognize, those that impose external timelines on our emotional journeys. Edwin, who had been thoughtfully listening, leans forward. From an academic perspective, I find questions like, isn't technology too complicated for you? Particularly revealing. He removes his glasses, polishing them carefully. Such questions reflect cognitive biases about aging rather than reality. Research consistently shows older adults readily adapt to new technologies when provided appropriate context and motivation. He smiles wryly. I no longer debate this point. I simply change the subject, refusing to dignify stereotypes with defense. That's the fifth question, Leo notes, assumptions about cognitive abilities masked as concern. The conversation deepens as Leo introduces another boundary-violating question. Shouldn't you be taking it easy at your age? Frank's expression hardens. My neighbor says this every time he sees me working in my garden, as if retirement should be spent in a rocking chair, gradually disappearing. He shakes his head. Last week I was installing new raised beds, a project I've planned for months, and he practically tried to take the shovel from my hands. How did you respond? Ruby asks, her eyes bright with interest. I used to explain that gardening keeps me healthy, that my doctor actually encourages it, Frank replies. But now, I just smile and say, I enjoy staying active and continue my work. No justification needed, Leo nods approvingly. That's an excellent transition into discussing response strategies. Frank just illustrated the first one, acknowledging without explaining. It's surprisingly effective, Frank adds. Without my lengthy justifications to engage with, my neighbor actually stayed only a moment before moving on. Leo writes, acknowledge briefly, then stop on a new card. When we explain, we inadvertently validate the premise of the intrusive question. We position ourselves as defendants when no defense is required. Edwin nods thoughtfully. The Stoics would call this assent, the moment when we accept an external impression as true. By explaining ourselves, we tacitly agree that the questioner has the right to judge our choices. Exactly, Leo confirms. Our second strategy is redirection. Ruby, you've mastered this one. Ruby grins, the streak in her silver hair catching the light. When my son starts in about downsizing to something more manageable, I immediately ask about his children or his work, something he loves talking about. By the time he realizes what happened, the moment to interrogate my living situation has passed. Redirection works because most people prefer talking about themselves, Leo explains. It's not manipulation, it's simply shifting to a more productive conversation. Nora, the attorney, straightens in her chair. In court, I often use strategic silence. It's remarkable how uncomfortable silence makes people who are overstepping. That's our third strategy, Leo affirms. Comfortable silence. When someone asks an inappropriate question, simply look at them calmly, perhaps with a slight smile, and remain quiet. They'll usually rush to fill the silence, Nora continues, often answering their own question or moving to a different topic entirely. Diane looks skeptical. I'm not sure I could pull that off without seeming angry. It takes practice, Nora admits. The key is maintaining a relaxed expression. You're not giving them the silent treatment, you're simply declining to engage. Our fourth strategy comes from Frank again, Leo continues. Humor can diffuse tension while establishing boundaries. Frank chuckles. When my daughter starts questioning whether I'm eating properly, as if I'm suddenly incapable of feeding myself after 75 years, I sometimes say, "Well, I was planning to have rocks for dinner, but I suppose I could consider food instead." The circle erupts in laughter. The absurdity makes the point without confrontation, Frank explains. She usually laughs too, and we move on to actual conversation. These first four strategies, brief acknowledgement, redirection, strategic, silence, and gentle humor, all share a common principle, Leo observes. They avoid justification. When we justify our choices to those who have no authority over us, we inadvertently hand them that authority. Edwin removes his glasses thoughtfully. It reminds me of Marcus Aurelius's observation. The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none of them know anything about the subject. Precisely, Leo nods. Now let's explore our next question. Have you prepared everything for you know after? Ruby rolls her eyes. My daughter-in-law asked me this last Christmas. Merry Christmas to you too. It's a profound boundary violation, Edwin notes, disguising morbid curiosity, or worse, impatience about inheritance as practical concern. Leo writes this down as the sixth question, inappropriate inquiries about end-of-life planning. How did you respond, Ruby? Diane asks. I used the fifth strategy, Ruby replies with a mischievous smile. I call it absurd exaggeration. I told her I'd arranged for my ashes to be mixed with glitter and fired from cannons over the Pacific. Again, laughter fills the room. While I might not recommend that exact approach, Leo smiles, the principle is sound. Sometimes treating an inappropriate question as if it were a joke returns dignity to the moment. But some questions hit too, close to the heart for humor, Diane says quietly. When my sister-in-law asked if I'd considered that Richard might just be interested in Harold's pension, a pained silence falls over the group. For those moments, Leo says gently, we have our sixth strategy, name the boundary directly. Something like, that question touches on something very personal that I don't wish to discuss. Isn't that confrontational? Diane asks. It's direct, but not hostile, Leo clarifies. You're simply being transparent about your boundaries. Most people will respect that clarity, Nora nods. In legal negotiations, I often found that clearly stating parameters was more effective than dancing around them. People may not like boundaries, but they generally respect them once clearly established. Our seventh question, Leo continues, often comes from adult children. Wouldn't you be happier living closer to family? Frank sighs heavily. My daughter in Phoenix sends me real estate listings monthly. The hidden assumption, Edwin observes, is that proximity to family automatically trumps all other considerations that make a place home, our communities, routines, support systems, and memories. For this, Leo suggests, we have our seventh strategy, the appreciative deflection. I appreciate your concern, but I'm content where I am. The but negates the appreciation, Nora points out. I prefer and instead of but. It acknowledges their position while maintaining yours. Excellent point, Leo agrees. The appreciative deflection, I appreciate your concern, and I'm content where I am. I've tried that, Frank says with a hint of frustration. My daughter just persists. Then, we move to our eighth strategy, Leo responds, physical disconnection. When someone continues pressing after you've set a verbal boundary, it's perfectly acceptable to physically remove yourself. I need to refresh my drink, or, excuse me, I see someone I need to speak with. Just walk away? Frank looks skeptical. With dignity, Leo clarifies. Not storming off, but calmly creating distance. It's not rude to end an interaction that has become intrusive. Edwin nods. Epictetus advised, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid with regard to external things. Meaning? Ruby asks. It's better to be considered slightly impolite than to sacrifice your inner peace, Edwin explains. The group falls silent, contemplating this wisdom. Let's address our 8th question, Leo says. Don't you think your house is too big for just you now? He looks around. Who's heard this one? Nearly every hand rises. The presumption, Edwin notes, is that our living spaces should be proportional to some arbitrary formula rather than our desires and needs. My son said this exact thing last month, Ruby shares, but this house is my studio, my sanctuary, and frankly, my joy. Why should I trade that for efficiency? What are your thoughts on this? Comment below so we can know what you think. Continuing. This brings us to our 8th strategy, Leo says, the philosophical redirect. Instead of defending your choice, pose a philosophical question that challenges their assumption. What is the right amount of space for a person to thrive, or how do we measure the value of a home beyond its square footage? That seems confrontational, Diane hesitates. It's actually the opposite, Edwin explains. You're elevating the conversation from a personal judgment to a philosophical consideration. You're inviting deeper thinking rather than rejecting their question outright. Leo nods. It transforms a moment of potential conflict into an opportunity for connection through meaningful conversation. If they engage with the philosophical question, you've created understanding. If they don't, they'll likely drop the original intrusive question. I'd like to share something personal, Leo says, his voice quieter than usual. My nephew has been making helpful suggestions about distributing family heirlooms before it's too late. The 9th question, have you considered donating your possessions now? The room grows still. That's thinly disguised impatience about inheritance, Frank says bluntly. Yes, Leo admits. And at first, I found myself explaining my attachment to each item, justifying why I wasn't ready to part with things that hold a lifetime of memories. He looks around the circle. But I realized that explaining creates vulnerability. When I stopped justifying my choices, the questions eventually stopped. What strategy did you use? Ruby asks. Our 9th and perhaps most powerful, the prepared phrase, Leo replies, having ready responses that neither defend nor explain. For inheritance questions, I have a plan in place that works for me. For housing questions, my current home meets my needs perfectly. For relationship questions, I'm comfortable with my choices. Simple, clear, and final. Nora nods approvingly. The advantage of prepared phrases is that they require no thought in potentially emotional moments. Leo explains, they become a reflex that protects your boundaries. As the session continues, the group begins organizing their insights into a framework they playfully call the Elder's Handbook to Peace. Each member contributes personal experiences with intrusive questions and strategies that preserve their dignity. There's something powerful about what we're discovering together, Leo says, looking at the gathered note cards where they've recorded their insights. We're not just collecting responses to annoying questions, we're reclaiming our dignity. Edwin nods, his academic demeanor softening. The Stoics believed that true freedom comes not from controlling external events, but from mastering our responses to them. What we're developing here embodies that ancient wisdom. I've never thought of it that way, Ruby admits, but there's something liberating about knowing I don't have to justify my choices to anyone, not even family. That brings us to another common question, Leo says, one that many of us have heard. Wouldn't you be happier living closer to your family? Frank sighs heavily. My daughter in Phoenix sends me real estate listings monthly. She means well, but The hidden assumption, Edwin observes, is that proximity to family automatically trumps all other considerations that make a place home: our communities, routines, support systems, and memories. What's worked for me, Nora shares, is what I call the appreciation connection approach. I say something like, I appreciate your desire to be closer, and I'm grateful we can stay connected in meaningful ways despite the distance. That acknowledges their love without conceding to their solution. Leo nods approvingly. It also gently reminds them that connection isn't solely dependent on physical proximity. I've tried similar approaches, Frank says with a hint of frustration. My daughter just persists. Then perhaps it's time for a more direct conversation. Leo suggests, not about housing, but about respect for your choices. Sometimes what presents as concern about living arrangements is actually anxiety about losing influence. That resonates deeply, Diane admits. Since Harold passed, my children's helpful suggestions feel more like attempts to step into their father's decision-making role. Which brings us to another powerful strategy, Leo says, distinguishing concern from control. When someone frames control as care, we can acknowledge their concern while declining their solution. How would that sound? Ruby asks. Something like, I know your suggestions come from a place of caring, and I value that. I'm comfortable with my current arrangements and will let you know if that changes. Leo demonstrates. It sets a boundary. Without rejecting their love, Edwin notes. Quite elegant. Let's address another difficult question, Leo continues. Don't you think your house is too big for just you now? Nearly everyone in the circle nods in recognition. The presumption, Edwin says, is that our living spaces should be proportional to some arbitrary formula rather than our desires and needs. My son said this exact thing last month, Ruby shares. But this house is my studio, my sanctuary, and frankly my joy. Why should I trade that for efficiency? For questions that prescribe how we should live, Leo suggests, I've found it effective to respond with your own values rather than defensive justifications. My home continues to serve my needs, including my need for creative space, memories, and independence. That's powerful, Nora agrees. It shifts from defending against their criteria to asserting your own. I'd like to share something personal, Leo says, his voice quieter than usual. My nephew has been making helpful suggestions about distributing family heirlooms before it's too late. The room grows still. That's thinly disguised impatience about inheritance, Frank says bluntly. Yes, Leo admits, and at first I found myself explaining my attachment to each item, justifying why I wasn't ready to part with things that hold a lifetime of memories. He looks around the circle, but I realize that explaining creates vulnerability. When I stopped justifying my choices, the questions eventually stopped. What approach worked? Ruby asks. I developed what I call prepared phrases, Leo replies. Short, clear statements that neither defend nor explain. For inheritance questions, I have a plan in place that works for me. For housing questions, my current home meets my needs perfectly. For relationship questions, I'm comfortable with my choices. Simple, clear, and final. Nora nods approvingly. The advantage of prepared phrases is that they require no thought in potentially emotional moments, Leo explains. They become a reflex that protects your boundaries. Diane leans forward. I've struggled with another question since meeting. Richard, people ask, aren't you concerned about the age difference? As if I haven't considered every aspect of our relationship. That's about perceived vulnerability, Edwin observes. They assume age difference creates power imbalance without considering your agency or wisdom. For these questions that question your judgment, Leo suggests, I recommend what I call confident assumption. Instead of defending your decisions, simply proceed as if your competence isn't in question, because it shouldn't be. How would that work? Diane asks. When someone questions your relationship choices, Leo explains, instead of listing reasons why it works, you might say, Richard, and I complement each other beautifully. We're planning a trip to the coast next month, moving the conversation forward as if their doubt is irrelevant. Diane nods slowly. I like that. All these strategies serve one purpose, Leo reminds the group. They allow us to protect our dignity without becoming bitter or isolated. We remain engaged, but on our own terms. Frank, who has been quiet for some time, speaks up. What about questions from medical professionals? My doctor recently asked if I'd considered simplifying my medication routine by moving to a care facility. I was stunned. Even well-intentioned professionals can cross boundaries, Edwin nods, perhaps especially those accustomed to authority. For professional settings, Nora suggests, drawing on her legal experience, I find it effective to ask clarifying questions that reveal assumptions. Are you suggesting my current medication management is inadequate? Forces them to either back down or be explicit about their concerns. That's our next strategy, Leo agrees. The revealing question. When someone disguises judgment as concern, a clarifying question often exposes the unwarranted assumption. It feels confrontational, Frank worries. It's direct but professional, Nora assures him. You're simply requesting clarity, which is your right in any professional relationship. Ruby tucks a strand of purple-streaked hair behind her ear. There's another question that particularly bothers me. When I mention wanting to try something new, like when I started learning digital art last year, there's always someone who says, at your age, wouldn't something less demanding be more appropriate? As if creativity has an expiration date, Edwin remarks dryly. Exactly, Ruby nods emphatically. It implies that growth and learning should diminish rather than deepen with age. For these questions that use age as a disqualifier, Leo suggests, I found what I call the regardless of age response effective. Something like passion and curiosity don't retire when we do. I like that, Ruby smiles. Simple but profound. It acknowledges the age factor without accepting its limiting premise, Leo explains. Another variation might be, the best time to start something new is always now. Nora straightens her linen pants. Since retiring from the firm, I've encountered a slightly different question. The subtle but persistent, are you sure you can handle that? Whenever I mention any project or activity more complex than knitting, the presumption of incapacity, Edwin nods, often couched as concern but functioning as doubt. I've started responding by talking about the project with enthusiasm and specific detail, Nora says. Last week, when my former colleague questioned whether I could manage organizing the legal aid fundraiser, I simply discussed my plans for the venue selection and keynote speaker, as if her doubt hadn't been expressed. That's exactly what I mean by confident assumption, Leo affirms. You proceed as if your competence isn't in question because it shouldn't be. It worked beautifully, Nora smiles. She actually ended up offering to help rather than questioning my abilities. I've noticed another pattern, Edwin observes, cleaning his glasses methodically. Questions that contain false choices. Wouldn't you rather have help with that, implying the only options are struggling alone or accepting unwanted assistance? False dichotomies. Leo nods, writing this down. Limiting the conversation to two options when many might exist. For these, Edwin suggests, we might employ what philosophers call rejecting the premise. We identify and decline the false choice itself, opening space for alternatives. How would that sound in practice? Diane asks. If someone asks, wouldn't you rather have help with that? You might respond, I appreciate options beyond just doing it alone or having help, Edwin explains. This opens space for solutions the questioner hasn't considered, like doing it differently, doing it later, or finding a middle path. That reminds me, Frank says, of my daughter's constant, wouldn't it be easier if you just used a service for that, whenever I mention household maintenance? The assumption being that easier is always preferable to meaningful, Ruby notes. Exactly. Frank nods. but fixing things myself connects me to my home and keeps my skills sharp. It isn't just about getting the task done. Which brings us to another valuable strategy, Leo says. Value clarification. When someone assumes convenience trumps all other values, gently illuminate your different priorities. Like saying, I value the process as much as the outcome, Frank asks. Precisely, Leo affirms. Or, meaning often comes from engagement, not convenience. These are all valuable for one-on-one interactions, Nora observes. But what about group settings? Last month at my nephew's wedding, I mentioned considering a Mediterranean cruise, and 3 different people launched into warnings about seniors being targeted by scammers abroad. Group dynamics do change things, Leo acknowledges. When multiple people echo the same limiting assumption, it can feel like consensus reality. For group situations, Edwin suggests, selective engagement might be effective. Respond only to the constructive parts of what's said, if any exist, and simply let the rest pass without acknowledgement. And if nothing constructive was offered, Diane asks, twisting her wedding ring, then you might try what I call a topic bridge, Leo suggests. Acknowledge you've heard them, then intentionally bridge to a related but more positive topic. Example? Ruby asks. If people are warning about travel dangers, Leo explains, you might say, safety is always important when traveling. Speaking of travel, has anyone been to the new Mediterranean restaurant downtown? That's quite skillful, Nora admits. It neither argues nor concedes, but gently shifts the conversational energy. I've realized something, Ruby says thoughtfully. The most intrusive questions often come from those closest to us, family members who believe intimacy grants unlimited access to our choices. That's a profound insight, Leo agrees. Which brings us to perhaps our most challenging question type, the appeal to family authority. Don't you think your children should have some say in this decision? The room grows quiet as each member contemplates times they've encountered this question. This may be the most difficult boundary to establish, Edwin finally says, because it challenges the very structure of family relationships that may have existed for decades. For this, Leo suggests, we need what I call loving definition, clearly defining the difference between connection and control, while affirming the importance of the relationship. How would that sound, Diane asks. Something like, I value your place in my life too much to confuse it with decision-making. Authority. Our relationship thrives when we respect each other's autonomy, Leo offers. That's quite direct, Frank observes. It needs to be, Nora says firmly. Family relationships are often where boundaries are most critical and most challenged. Please, hit the subscribe button if you appreciate advice like this. It helps us create more content you can use. Back to where we were. Speaking of challenging, Ruby sighs. What about when people ask intensely personal financial questions? How are you managing on just your pension? Or can you really afford that on a fixed income? Financial invasions, Leo nods. These questions are particularly problematic because they combine judgment with the expectation of private disclosure. For these, Nora suggests, a simple privacy statement works well. I make it a policy not to discuss financial details. No justification needed, Leo affirms. Financial privacy is a perfectly reasonable boundary. As their session continues, the group begins refining their approaches, sharing personal experiences and testing responses with each other. Ruby demonstrates how she deflects the "isn't technology too complicated for you?" question by saying, I find most interfaces quite intuitive once I understand their purpose. Would you mind passing the salt? The redirection happens so smoothly that the intrusive question loses its momentum. Frank practices responding to, why do you still drive? With a prepared phrase, I'm confident in my driving abilities and am regularly assessed. The brevity and confidence of his response leave no room for debate. Diane works through responding to questions about her relationship with calm confidence rather than defensive explanation. Richard brings joy to my life becomes her simple, dignified response that neither invites challenge nor suggests insecurity. Nora demonstrates how to use a revealing question to address assumptions about her cognitive abilities. What specifically makes you think I'd have trouble understanding that concept? The precision of her query often leaves the questioner stumbling to justify their assumptions. Edwin shares philosophical perspectives that help frame their practical strategies in deeper wisdom. Epictetus taught that we should concern ourselves, not with what others think, but with acting according to nature and reason. In modern terms, we might say, focus on living with integrity rather than seeking approval. What we're developing, Leo observes, is more than a collection of responses. It's a philosophy of engagement based on self-respect and boundary awareness. I've noticed something remarkable, Ruby shares. Since I've started using these approaches, the intrusive questions have actually decreased. It's as if people sense the boundary and respect it without explicit discussion. That's the ultimate goal, Leo nods. Not having to constantly defend boundaries, but establishing them so clearly they become part of the relationship's understood parameters. I wonder if we should share these insights beyond our circle, Edwin suggests. Many at Oak Ridge Haven and beyond could benefit from what we're learning. Perhaps we could organize our thoughts into something more formal, Leo agrees, not just for ourselves, but as a legacy of wisdom for others. A handbook of sorts, Diane suggests. The Elder's Handbook to Peace, Ruby offers with a smile. Sounds better than how to cold-shoulder nosy people. The group laughs, the tension of the deep work they've done releasing in shared humor. Over the next several weeks, the Wisdom Circle continues meeting, now with renewed purpose. They refine their strategies, document their experiences, and gradually shape their handbook, initially just notes for themselves, but evolving into something more substantial. What's remarkable, Edwin observes during their 5th session, is how these strategies align with ancient wisdom traditions. The Stoics taught that true dignity comes not from others' approval, but from integrity to one's own values. And Buddhism teaches that attachment to others' opinions creates suffering, Ruby adds. When we release the need for approval, we find peace. What's wonderful is that we're not just philosophizing, Nora points out. We're developing practical tools that translate wisdom into daily life. As they continue refining their approach, the group notices subtle shifts in their relationships outside the circle. Frank reports that his son's questioning of his driving has decreased after several calm, confident responses without justification. Diane shares that her sister-in-law actually apologized for her earlier comments about Richard, saying she'd never considered how intrusive her questions had been. Ruby describes how her daughter now asks, "Would you like my input about?" Rather than making prescriptive statements about Ruby's choices, Nora notes that former colleagues have stopped asking if she misses being relevant since she began responding with descriptions of her current meaningful activities without defensiveness. Edwin shares that his nephew has started seeking his wisdom about life decisions rather than treating him as someone to be managed. These changes suggest something profound, Leo observes. When we stop participating in the diminishment of our dignity, we not only reclaim our own peace, but often elevate the entire relationship. It reminds me of water, Ruby says thoughtfully. When we create a clear channel for how we wish to be addressed, most people naturally flow into that path of least resistance. Though some, Frank adds with a dry smile, need a little more redirecting than others. The group laughs, the shared humor cementing their bond. I believe we're ready for a real-world test, Leo suggests as their 6th session ends. The community gathering next week will provide plenty of opportunities to practice our strategies in a larger social setting. The following week, the Oak Ridge, Haven monthly gathering buzzes with conversation as residents and visitors mingle in the large community room. The Wisdom Circle members have intentionally spread throughout the space, each silently noticing the dynamics of age-related conversations around them. Frank stands by a detailed model railway display he's been working on for months, carefully, adjusting a miniature signal station when a new resident approaches. "This is impressive," the man says, genuinely admiring the intricate landscape. Then, noticing Frank's careful adjustments to the tiny components, he adds with well-meaning concern, "Shouldn't you be taking it easy at your age, though? This looks like it requires a lot of precision." The Wisdom Circle members, scattered throughout the room, exchange knowing glances, recognizing the moment as a perfect test case for their work together. Frank smiles, neither defensive nor irritated. "I enjoy staying active," he says simply, then smoothly changes the subject. "The locomotives are all scaled models of the Western Pacific Railroad circa 1950. Did you have an interest in trains growing up?" No explanation, no justification, just dignity preserved through selective engagement. The new resident, finding no purchase for his concern, happily shifts to discussing his childhood fascination with trains. A genuine connection forms, uncontaminated by the patronizing dynamic that could have developed. Across the room, Ruby notices the exchange and gives Frank a subtle nod of appreciation. They've accomplished something meaningful, not just for themselves, but potentially for everyone navigating the complex terrain of aging with dignity. Later that evening, as the Wisdom Circle gathers in their usual meeting place, there's a tangible sense of accomplishment among them. What began as a simple discussion about intrusive questions has evolved into something transformative, not just for their own peace of mind, but for the quality of their relationships. "I saw what happened with the new resident," Leo says to Frank with an appreciative nod. "Your response was masterful, simple, dignified, and effective." Frank smiles, a hint of pride in his eyes. It felt different this time. Instead of that familiar surge of defensiveness, I felt calm, in control. "That's exactly what we've been working toward," Edwin observes. "Not control over others' questions, but mastery of our own responses." Ruby tucks a strand of purple-streaked hair behind her ear. "You know what I've realized through our work together? These questions that once diminished me, they say far more about the questioner than they do about me." Profound insight, Leo nods. When someone questions your living arrangements, driving, or technology use, they're often projecting their own fears about aging onto you. And by refusing to accept those projections, Nora adds, we not only preserve our dignity, but actually help them confront their own anxieties more directly. Diane, who has been quietly reflective, speaks up. "I think what we've created here goes beyond strategies for handling difficult questions. We've rediscovered the wisdom that comes with our years, the ability to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't." "The Elder's Handbook to Peace," Leo says, holding up the collection of notes they've assembled over their weeks together, not just for ourselves, but for anyone navigating the journey of aging with dignity. As the sun sets beyond the large windows of Oak Ridge Haven, casting a golden light across their circle, each member realizes they've found something precious. Not just strategies for handling intrusive questions, but a deeper peace that comes from knowing their worth isn't determined by others' perceptions. The wisdom they've gathered isn't just for elders. It's for anyone who has felt their boundaries crossed, their choices questioned, their dignity diminished, and that includes you. Perhaps you're not facing questions about retirement homes or driving capabilities. Your intrusive questions might look different. Challenges to your parenting choices, your career decisions, your relationship status, or your personal priorities. But the wisdom remains the same. You don't owe explanations for choices that are yours alone to make. Your dignity isn't negotiable, and protecting your peace isn't selfish, it's necessary. Think about the questions in your life that leave you feeling diminished or defensive. Which conversations regularly rob you of your peace? Where do you find yourself over-explaining choices that require no justification? How might your relationships transform if you responded with quiet confidence rather than defensive explanation? What boundaries, lovingly but firmly established, might actually deepen your connections rather than damaging them? The members of the Wisdom Circle discovered that when they stopped participating in the diminishment of their dignity, they not only reclaimed their own peace, but often elevated their entire relationships. Those who truly care about you will respect your boundaries once clearly established. As you move forward from this moment, I encourage you to experiment with just one strategy we've explored today. Perhaps it's the prepared phrase that neither defends nor explains. Maybe it's the confident assumption that your competence isn't in question. Or perhaps it's simply the courage to let silence speak when intrusive questions deserve no answer. Whatever approach resonates with you, remember that wisdom isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing which questions deserve your energy and which don't. The journey to preserving your dignity isn't about becoming cold or distant. It's about being warm and engaged on your own terms. It's about creating relationships based on mutual respect rather than invasive concern. How will you begin reclaiming your peace today? What conversation will you approach differently, knowing that your dignity isn't determined by others' perceptions of you? The wisdom that comes with years lived fully isn't about knowing more, it's about knowing what matters. And what matters, ultimately, is the quality of peace you carry within yourself, regardless of the questions life or others may throw your way. Every day, we share stories that speak to the heart. Subscribe and join us. Thanks for watching.